It was a quiet evening in suburban Virginia, and the deputy director of the CIA, James Caldwell, was driving home after an exhausting day at Langley. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. His black sedan hummed softly as he navigated through the dimly lit roads. James wasn't in his usual suit today. Instead, he wore jeans and a leather jacket, blending into the crowd like any other middle-aged man heading home to unwind. His government ID rested safely in his pocket, tucked away with the rest of his belongings. He didn't feel like a high-ranking official tonight. He felt ordinary. James loved these moments of normalcy. Being one of the most powerful figures in intelligence meant that his life was rarely private or predictable. Every decision he made carried weight, every conversation held significance, and every move he took was scrutinized. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he was just a man enjoying the calm before stepping back into the chaos of his responsibilities. Or so he thought. As James approached a quiet intersection near his neighborhood, red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind him. Startled, he glanced at his rearview mirror and saw a police cruiser pulling up close. Confused, he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. He hadn't broken any traffic laws, no speeding, no reckless driving, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, he turned off the engine and waited patiently, wondering what this could be about. Two officers stepped out of their car. One was younger, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing aviator sunglasses despite the fading light. His name tag read, Officer Kyle. The other officer was older, shorter, and wiry, with graying hair peeking out from under his cap. His badge identified him as Officer Rick. Both men walked toward James's car with deliberate steps, their boots crunching against the asphalt. Something about their body language felt off. Their movements weren't casual or relaxed. They were rigid, almost aggressive. Kyle approached the driver's side window while Rick stood slightly back, scanning the area. "License and registration, sir," Kyle demanded curtly, shining his flashlight directly into James's face. The beam blinded him momentarily, forcing him to squint. There was something sharp in Kyle's tone, a mix of authority and hostility that made James uneasy. He nodded politely and reached for his wallet, pulling out his driver's license. Then, leaning forward, he opened the glove compartment to retrieve the vehicle registration. "Take it easy there," Kyle barked abruptly, gripping the handle of his flashlight tighter. "Keep your hands where I can see them." James froze, his fingers still resting on the edge of the glove compartment. Slowly, he withdrew his hand and placed it on the steering wheel, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I'm just getting my registration," James explained calmly, keeping his voice steady. "It's right here." He pointed to the open compartment, but Kyle didn't seem convinced. Instead, he signaled for Rick to come closer. Together, they peered into the car, their eyes darting suspiciously around the interior. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a routine stop, it felt personal. Rick leaned in now, his gaze narrowing. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. James hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm a federal employee," he replied simply, choosing his words carefully. He didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily, but his answer only seemed to fuel their suspicion. Kyle scoffed audibly, shaking his head. "Federal employee? Driving around in this fancy car? You sure about that?" His tone dripped with disbelief, and James could feel the undertones of prejudice creeping into the conversation. These men weren't questioning him because of anything he'd done. They were judging him based on how he looked, and that realization hit James hard. For years, James had dealt with subtle forms of discrimination. Growing up as a black man in America, he'd learned to navigate spaces where people often underestimated him or questioned his presence. But this was different. This was blatant disrespect disguised as law enforcement. It wasn't just about being stopped, it was about being treated as guilty until proven innocent. James clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He wanted to argue, to demand respect, but he knew better. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. It would only give them more ammunition to use against him. Instead, James focused on staying composed. He handed over his documents without another word, letting his actions speak for themselves. Kyle snatched them roughly, examining the license closely. When he saw the name and address listed, his expression shifted slightly. James lived in a prestigious neighborhood known for its affluent residents, many of whom held influential positions in government and business. That detail alone should have raised questions in Kyle's mind, but instead it seemed to deepen his mistrust. "You live here?" Kyle asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. James nodded, maintaining eye contact. "Yes, I do," he replied, evenly. Rick chimed in then, his tone equally skeptical. "And you're telling us you're a federal employee? What agency exactly?" James hesitated again, weighing his options. Revealing his true identity might end the ordeal quickly, but it also risked inflaming tensions further. In the end, he decided to wait, to see if they would de-escalate on their own. But Kyle wasn't done yet. Without asking permission, he began, rummaging through the glove compartment, searching for anything incriminating. James watched silently, his patience wearing thin. This wasn't protocol, it was harassment. Finally, unable to tolerate their behavior any longer, James reached into his pocket and pulled out his CIA badge. Holding it up where both officers could see it, he spoke firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like steel. "I'm the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency," he said, meeting their stunned gazes head-on. For a moment, there was silence, then panic set in. Kyle's flashlight slipped from his hand, clattering onto the ground, while Rick took a step back, his face pale. "Sir, we didn't realize," Kyle stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating instantly. Rick tried to salvage the situation, fumbling for words. "We were just doing our job, making sure everything's safe." But James cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Your job is to protect citizens, not harass them based on your biases," he said coldly, his piercing gaze locking onto theirs. For the first time in years, these two men felt truly powerless and utterly exposed. The encounter left James shaken but resolute. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. And deep down, he knew this wouldn't be the last time someone faced injustice simply because of the color of their skin. But maybe, just maybe, his position gave him the power to change that. The air was thick with tension as James Caldwell pulled away from the curb, leaving officers Kyle and Rick standing in stunned silence. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. Though the confrontation had ended, the weight of it lingered heavily on his mind. He replayed the scene over and over again. Their suspicious stares, their invasive questions, their blatant disregard for basic respect. It wasn't just about being stopped. It was about being judged before even opening his mouth. James felt a mix of anger, frustration, and sadness bubbling inside him. But beneath all those emotions, there was something else. Resolve. As he drove through the quiet streets of his neighborhood, James couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. This wasn't the first time he'd faced discrimination, nor would it be the last. Growing up as a black man in America, he'd learned early on that life came with its own set of challenges that others didn't have to face. Whether it was being followed around in stores, questioned during routine traffic stops, or underestimated in professional settings, James had experienced it all. But tonight's encounter was different. Tonight, two officers of the law had crossed a line, using their authority not to protect but to intimidate. And they weren't just targeting him. They were perpetuating a system that allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. By the time James reached his driveway, his thoughts had shifted from personal grievances to broader implications. What happened? Tonight wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern that needed to change. As he stepped out of his car and walked toward the front door, he made a decision. He wouldn't let this slide. Not this time. Not when he had the power to do something about it. The next morning, James arrived at Langley earlier than usual. The sprawling headquarters buzzed with activity, analysts rushing down hallways clutching folders, operatives exchanging hushed conversations in corners. Despite the chaos, James moved with purpose, heading straight for his office. Once inside, he closed the door behind him, shutting out the noise. Sitting at his desk, he stared at the stack of reports piled high in front of him. Normally, these documents demanded his full attention, but today his mind kept drifting back to the previous night. After hours of deliberation, James picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Department of Justice. Within minutes, he was speaking directly to the Attorney General. "I need to report an incident," James said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He recounted the events in detail, describing how Kyle and Rick had profiled him based on his appearance and disregarded protocol entirely. "This isn't just about me," he emphasized. "It's about accountability and ensuring no one else has to endure what I did." The Attorney General listened intently, promising swift action. By noon, internal affairs teams were already investigating the officers involved. Meanwhile, word of the incident began spreading like wildfire within law enforcement circles. At first, it started as whispers among precincts, officers sharing rumors about a mysterious federal employee who turned out to be none other than the deputy director of the CIA. Some sympathized with Kyle and Rick, chalking the event up to an honest mistake. Others, however, saw it as a glaring example of systemic racism and abuse of power. Back at the station where Kyle and Rick worked, the atmosphere grew tense. Their colleagues avoided eye contact, unsure whether to offer support or distance themselves entirely. Both men spent the day holed up in separate offices, dreading what might come next. They knew the investigation wouldn't stop here. It would dig deeper, exposing cracks in the foundation of their department. For Kyle, guilt gnawed at the edges of his conscience. He hadn't intended to cause harm. He'd simply acted on instinct, letting his biases guide his actions. But now, faced with the consequences, he realized how wrong he'd been. Rick, on the other hand, remained defensive, insisting they were just doing their job. Yet he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. Meanwhile, James wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt vindicated knowing that justice might finally be served. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that came with wielding his influence so publicly. As a top official in one of the most powerful agencies in the world, he understood the weight of his position. Every move he made carried repercussions, not just for himself, but for countless others. Would this lead to real change? Or would it simply reinforce existing divides? That evening, as James sat alone in his study, he reflected on the complexities of power. Being the deputy director of the CIA meant having access to resources and connections most people could only dream of. But it also meant carrying the responsibility of using that power wisely. James had always believed in leading by example, in fostering trust rather than fear. Yet tonight's events reminded him that sometimes leadership required taking bold steps, even if it meant stepping into uncomfortable territory. By the third day, news of the incident had leaked to the media. Reporters scrambled to piece together details, publishing articles that painted James Caldwell as both a victim and a symbol of resistance against racial profiling. Headlines blared across newspapers and dominated news channels. Deputy Director of CIA stopped by racist cops, read one. Another proclaimed, CIA official exposes systemic bias in law enforcement. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags trending nationwide. Supporters rallied behind James, calling for sweeping reforms in policing practices. Critics, however, accused him of overreacting, arguing that the officer's actions were justified given the circumstances. Amidst the whirlwind of attention, James remained composed. He issued a carefully worded statement urging calm and emphasizing the need for constructive dialogue. "What happened to me is not unique," he wrote. "It reflects a larger issue that affects communities across our nation. We must work together to address these systemic problems and build a fairer, more equitable society." Privately, though, he struggled with the spotlight. While the public outcry brought much-needed awareness to the issue, it also highlighted the burden of representation. As a black man in a position of authority, James knew his actions, or lack thereof, would be scrutinized under a microscope. Despite the pressure, James refused to shy away from the moment. He began reaching out to civil rights organizations, policymakers, and advocacy groups, seeking ways to channel the momentum into tangible change. One afternoon, he met with leaders from a prominent anti-racism coalition to discuss potential initiatives. The meeting took place in a small conference room at Langley, the walls lined with maps and charts detailing global intelligence operations. Yet today, the focus was local. "We need to hold law enforcement accountable," James said, leaning forward in his chair. "But accountability alone isn't enough. We need training programs, community engagement efforts, and policies that promote transparency and trust." The group nodded in agreement, jotting down notes furiously. By the end of the session, they had outlined several concrete proposals, ranging from mandatory bias training for officers to increased oversight by independent review boards. Word of James's efforts spread quickly, earning him praise from allies and detractors alike. Invitations poured in for him to speak at conferences, participate in panel discussions, and advise lawmakers on reform initiatives. Initially, James hesitated, wary of stepping too far outside his comfort zone. But eventually he realized that staying silent would mean squandering a rare opportunity to effect meaningful change. So he accepted select invitations, using his platform to share stories of injustice and propose solutions. One evening, James stood before a packed auditorium at a national law enforcement summit. The audience consisted of police chiefs, elected officials, activists, and concerned citizens, all eager to hear what he had to say. As James approached the podium, the room fell silent. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. "I never thought I'd stand here today talking about my experience as a victim of racial profiling," James admitted, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion. "But here we are. And while my story may seem extraordinary because of my title, the truth is it's painfully ordinary for millions of Americans. Every day people are judged not by their character, but by the color of their skin. Every day lives are disrupted, and sometimes lost, because of biases that run deep within our institutions." He paused, scanning the crowd. Faces looked back at him, some nodding in agreement, others visibly uncomfortable. "Change won't happen overnight," James continued. "But it starts with acknowledging the problem. It starts with holding ourselves accountable, not just as individuals but as a society. And it starts with listening to those who've been marginalized for far too long." When James finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Many attendees approached him afterward, thanking him for his courage and insight. Among them was a young woman named Maya, a community organizer who had dedicated her life to fighting racial injustice. "Your voice matters," she told him earnestly. "People listen to you in ways they don't listen to us. Please keep pushing for change." James smiled faintly, touched by her words. "I will," he promised. "Because if I don't, who will?" As weeks passed, the fallout from the incident continued to reverberate. The days following the incident felt like a whirlwind for James Caldwell. Each morning he woke up to a barrage of emails, phone calls, and messages from people across the country, some offering support, others seeking guidance, and a few criticizing his decision to speak out. The media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down, with reporters camped outside his office and journalists calling him incessantly. It was overwhelming, but James couldn't ignore the opportunity this moment presented. For years he had worked behind the scenes, quietly shaping policies and strategies that impacted millions. Now he found himself thrust into the spotlight, standing at the forefront of a national conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. James knew he couldn't tackle this issue alone. Change required collaboration, and he needed allies who shared his vision. So, he reached out to trusted colleagues within the intelligence community, civil rights organizations, and grassroots movements. One of those colleagues was Dr. Evelyn Carter, a renowned sociologist and advocate for criminal justice reform. Evelyn had spent decades studying systemic racism and its effects on marginalized communities. When James called her, she didn't hesitate to join forces. "James, you're in a unique position right now," Evelyn told him during their first meeting. "People are watching, not just because of your title, but because of what you represent. You can amplify voices that often go unheard." Her words resonated deeply with James. He realized that his role wasn't just to lead by example, it was to create space for others to be heard. Together, James and Evelyn began drafting a comprehensive plan to address the root causes of racial profiling in law enforcement. They focused on 3 key areas: training, transparency, and trust. Training programs would educate officers on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity, helping them recognize and unlearn harmful stereotypes. Transparency initiatives would involve installing body cameras on all officers and creating independent review boards to investigate misconduct. Finally, building trust meant fostering stronger relationships between police departments and the communities they served, starting with regular town hall meetings and joint community service projects. While James and Evelyn worked tirelessly, behind closed doors, public pressure continued to mount. Social media campaigns gained traction, with hashtags like Trying Justice for All and Trying Accountability now trending daily. Activists organized protests in major cities, demanding immediate reforms. Even celebrities joined the movement, using their platforms to raise awareness and call for action. The momentum was undeniable, and James knew they had to act quickly before it fizzled out. One afternoon, James received an invitation to appear on Good Morning America, one of the most watched morning shows in the country. The producers wanted him to discuss his experience and share his thoughts on how to move forward. At first, James hesitated. He wasn't used to being in front of the camera, especially not in such a personal capacity, but Evelyn encouraged him to accept. "This is your chance to reach millions of people," she said. "Use it wisely." On the day of the interview, James dressed in a crisp navy suit and arrived at the studio early. As he waited backstage, he rehearsed his talking points, reminding himself to stay calm and composed. When the host introduced him, the live audience erupted in applause. James walked onto the set, shaking hands with the host before taking his seat. Cameras flashed, and the bright studio lights made him squint momentarily. But once the interview began, James spoke with clarity and conviction. "I've dedicated my career to protecting our nation's security," he started, looking directly into the camera. "But last week, I experienced something that shook me to my core. 2 officers stopped me simply because of the color of my skin. They questioned my identity, searched my car without cause, and treated me as if I were guilty until proven innocent. And let me be clear, this isn't just about me. This happens every day to countless Americans. It's time we acknowledge the problem and work together to fix it." The host nodded sympathetically, giving James space to elaborate. He talked about the importance of accountability, emphasizing that holding individuals responsible for their actions was only the beginning. "We need systemic change," he explained. "That means rethinking how we train our officers, how we hold them accountable, and how we rebuild trust with the communities they serve. It won't happen overnight, but it has to start somewhere." When the segment ended, the response was overwhelming. Viewers flooded social media with messages of support, praising James for his courage and honesty. Many shared their own stories of discrimination, highlighting the pervasive nature of the issue. Others expressed gratitude for his leadership, saying they finally felt seen and heard. For James, reading these responses was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because it reinforced how widespread the problem was, and inspiring because it reminded him why he was doing this: to give hope to those who felt powerless. Back at Langley, James faced mixed reactions from his colleagues. Some admired his willingness to take a stand, viewing it as a bold move that aligned with the agency's mission of promoting justice and equality. Others, however, worried about the potential fallout. "You're putting yourself and the agency in a vulnerable position," one senior official warned him during a private meeting. "What if this backfires? What if people use this against us? James listened patiently, understanding their concerns. But he also knew that staying silent carried its own risks. If we don't address these issues head-on, we risk losing credibility, he replied. The CIA exists to protect democracy, and part of that means ensuring fairness and justice for all citizens. If we shy away from difficult conversations, we fail in our mission. As weeks turned into months, progress began to take shape. Lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at implementing many of the reforms James and Evelyn had proposed. Police departments across the country started adopting new training protocols, incorporating modules on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. Independent review boards were established in several states, tasked with investigating allegations of misconduct and recommending disciplinary actions. Community outreach programs flourished, bringing officers and residents together to engage in open dialogue and collaborative efforts. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Critics argued that the reforms went too far, claiming they undermined law enforcement's ability to do their jobs effectively. Some officers resisted the new policies, feeling unfairly targeted and scrutinized. Tensions flared in certain precincts, leading to heated debates and occasional clashes. James understood the pushback. It was inevitable when challenging deeply ingrained systems, but he refused to compromise. Change is uncomfortable, he often said during interviews and panel discussions. But discomfort is necessary for growth. Amidst the chaos, James found solace in small victories. A young officer named Marcus approached him after a training session, thanking him for shedding light on issues he hadn't fully understood before. "I want to do better," Marcus admitted earnestly. "I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." Moments like these reminded James that while systemic change took time, individual transformations could happen instantly. One evening, as James sat in his study reviewing notes for an upcoming speech, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Maya, the community organizer he'd met at the law enforcement summit. "Just wanted to say thank you again," the message read. "Your voice matters more than you know. Keep going. We're with you." James smiled faintly, feeling a renewed sense of determination. He saved the message knowing it would serve as a reminder of why he kept fighting. By the end of the year, the ripple effects of James's actions were undeniable. Conversations about racial profiling and police accountability had become mainstream, sparking meaningful discussions in households, classrooms, and boardrooms alike. While there was still much work to be done, James felt hopeful. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he also knew that real change required persistence and resilience. As he reflected on everything that had transpired, James realized something profound. This journey wasn't just about exposing injustice or advocating for reform. It was about reclaiming humanity. By sharing his story, he had opened doors for others to share theirs. By speaking truth to power, he had inspired others to do the same. And by stepping into the spotlight, he had shown that even the most ordinary moments could spark extraordinary change. James leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the quiet suburban street below. The world outside seemed peaceful, almost serene. But he knew better. Beneath the surface, battles raged on, battles for equality, justice, and dignity. And though he couldn't fight them all, he vowed to keep pushing forward, one step at a time. Because sometimes even the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes. Months had passed since the night James Caldwell was stopped by officers Kyle and Rick. But the ripple effects of that encounter continued to shape lives far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The investigation into the officers' conduct dragged on, with internal affairs poring over every detail of the incident. Meanwhile, James found himself increasingly immersed in the fight for systemic reform, a role he hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities, and new reminders of how deeply entrenched racial bias was within institutions meant to protect and serve. One chilly morning, James sat in his Langley office, sipping coffee as he reviewed a draft report on police accountability measures. The document outlined specific steps law enforcement agencies could take to address racial profiling, from mandatory anti-bias training to stricter oversight mechanisms. While the proposals were ambitious, they weren't perfect, and James knew implementation would be even harder than drafting them. Still, he felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, there was tangible momentum behind these efforts. People were listening. Change, even if incremental, felt possible. Just as James finished reading the report, his assistant buzzed him on the intercom. "Sir, you have a visitor," she said hesitantly. "It's Officer Kyle." James froze, his fingers hovering over the papers scattered across his desk. Of all the people he expected to see, Kyle wasn't one of them. After a moment's pause, he instructed his assistant to send him in. When Kyle entered the room, James barely recognized him. Gone was the brash, overconfident officer who had questioned his identity and rifled through his car without cause. In his place stood a man visibly burdened by guilt and regret. His shoulders slumped, his eyes avoided direct contact, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a crumpled envelope. "Mr. Caldwell," Kyle began, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. I don't know where to start. I needed to say this to your face." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "What happened that night? It was wrong. I was wrong. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I treated you unfairly because of it. There's no excuse for that." James listened silently, his expression unreadable. Part of him wanted to lash out, to demand answers or hold Kyle accountable for the humiliation he'd endured. But another part of him saw vulnerability in the young officer's eyes, a glimmer of humanity beneath the uniform. Finally, James spoke. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. Kyle nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. It wasn't just about breaking protocol. It was about failing to see you as a person. You're someone's father, someone's friend, someone's leader, and I reduced you to a stereotype. That's not who I want to be." James leaned back in his chair, studying Kyle carefully. "You've taken the first step," he said after a long pause. "Acknowledging your mistakes is important. But true, growth comes from action. Are you willing to do the work? To unlearn those biases and become the kind of officer communities can trust?" Tears welled up in Kyle's eyes as he nodded again. "I am, sir. I promise you, I'll do whatever it takes." With trembling hands, he handed James the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter apologizing for the incident and outlining steps Kyle planned to take to educate himself on racial equity and implicit bias. James accepted the letter without comment, placing it gently on his desk. After Kyle left, James sat alone in his office, staring at the envelope. He didn't feel anger anymore, just exhaustion. Confrontations like this drained him emotionally, forcing him to relive painful memories while grappling with complex emotions. Yet, he also recognized the significance of moments like these. If Kyle could change, perhaps others could too. Perhaps redemption was still possible. That evening, James attended a town hall meeting organized by a local advocacy group. The event was held in a community center auditorium, packed with residents, eager to discuss policing reforms. As he walked onto the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. Some attendees held signs bearing slogans like, "Justice starts here," and "We deserve better." Others simply watched intently, their faces reflecting a mix of frustration and hope. The moderator introduced James, highlighting his role in sparking the national conversation about racial profiling. When it was his turn to speak, James stepped up to the microphone, scanning the diverse audience before him. "Thank you for having me here tonight," he began, his voice resonating through the room. "This isn't easy for any of us. Talking about race, power, and privilege forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. But if we're serious about creating a fairer society, we have to lean into that discomfort." He went on to share stories of individuals affected by discriminatory practices, emphasizing the human cost of systemic racism. "Every statistic represents a life," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "A son denied justice. A mother, stripped of dignity. A child growing up afraid of those sworn to protect them. These aren't abstract concepts, they're realities millions of Americans face daily. As James spoke, the energy in the room shifted. People nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears. When he finished, the moderator opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up immediately, each attendee eager to contribute to the dialogue. One woman shared her experience of being racially profiled during a routine traffic stop, describing how it left her feeling violated and powerless. Another man recounted witnessing police brutality in his neighborhood and called for greater transparency in investigations. A teenager expressed frustration with the lack of diversity among law enforcement officers, urging departments to recruit more candidates from marginalized communities. Listening to these voices, James felt both inspired and humbled. These were the people driving real change, not politicians or policymakers, but ordinary citizens demanding better. Their courage reminded him why he kept fighting, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. By the end of the meeting, several attendees approached James personally, thanking him for amplifying their concerns. Among them was a retired teacher named Clara, whose grandson had recently been arrested under questionable circumstances. "Your story gives us hope," she told him, her eyes glistening with tears. "Hope that maybe, just maybe, things can get better." The following weeks were a blur of activity. James traveled extensively, speaking at conferences, testifying before Congress, and meeting with grassroots organizations. At every stop, he emphasized the importance of collaboration, urging stakeholders to work together toward common goals. Slowly but surely, progress began to materialize. Police departments adopted stricter guidelines for traffic stops, ensuring officers had valid reasons before pulling someone over. Body cameras became standard equipment, providing crucial evidence. In cases of alleged misconduct, community advisory boards gained influence, giving residents a voice in shaping departmental policies. Yet despite these victories, resistance persisted. Critics accused reform advocates of undermining law enforcement, arguing that increased scrutiny made officers hesitant to perform their duties effectively. Some unions lobbied against proposed changes, claiming they would lead to widespread resignations. Tensions flared in certain cities, resulting in protests and counter-protests. James understood the backlash. It was inevitable when challenging entrenched systems, but he refused to waver. Progress isn't linear, he often reminded himself. Setbacks are part of the process. One particularly challenging day, James received an email from Rick, the second officer involved in the traffic stop. Unlike Kyle, Rick hadn't reached out earlier, and James assumed he remained defensive about the incident. But the email surprised him. "Mr. Caldwell," Rick wrote, "I owe you an apology. What happened that night was unacceptable, and I'm sorry for my role in it. I realize now that my actions perpetuated harm, and I'm committed to doing better moving forward." James read the message multiple times, weighing its sincerity. Rick's words lacked the raw vulnerability Kyle had shown, but they carried a similar acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Deciding to give him the benefit of the doubt, James replied, inviting Rick to join an upcoming training session on implicit bias. To his surprise, Rick accepted. The training session proved transformative for Rick and everyone else in attendance. Facilitated by Dr. Evelyn Carter, the program challenged participants to confront their own biases and consider how those biases influenced their interactions with others. Through role-playing exercises and candid discussions, officers learned practical strategies for fostering empathy and building trust. By the end of the day, many, including Rick, expressed gratitude for the experience, vowing to apply what they'd learned in their daily work. As months turned into a year, James reflected on how much had changed and how much still needed to be done. Racial profiling hadn't disappeared overnight, nor had mistrust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. But there were signs of progress: declining complaint rates, improved community relations, and growing public support for reform initiatives. Most importantly, Conversations about race and accountability had become normalized, creating space for difficult, yet necessary dialogues. In his private moments, James allowed himself to feel proud, not of himself, but of the collective effort fueling this movement. He thought about Kyle, Rick, Evelyn, Maya, Clara. A year had passed since the night James Caldwell was stopped by officers Kyle and Rick, but the impact of that single encounter continued to reverberate across the nation. What began as a personal humiliation for James had grown into a movement, a catalyst for change that reached far beyond his expectations. The deputy director of the CIA, once known primarily for his role in safeguarding national security, now found himself at the center of a broader struggle, dismantling systemic racism within law enforcement and society at large. James's days were no longer confined to the sterile corridors of Langley. Instead, he spent much of his time traveling, meeting with community leaders, policymakers, and activists who shared his vision of a fairer, more equitable world. He spoke at universities, addressed congressional committees, and participated in panel discussions alongside civil rights icons. Each appearance brought new challenges, forcing him to navigate delicate political landscapes while staying true to his principles. Yet despite the grueling schedule, James felt invigorated. For the first time in years, he saw tangible progress, not just in policies, but in people's attitudes. One crisp autumn morning, James arrived at a conference center in Washington, D.C., where he was scheduled to deliver the keynote address at a summit on criminal justice reform. The event drew hundreds of attendees, including police chiefs, academics, grassroots organizers, and ordinary citizens eager to contribute to the conversation. As he walked through the crowded hallways, James noticed posters lining the walls, each bearing powerful messages. Equality is not negotiable. Listen, learn, act, and justice for all. The atmosphere buzzed with energy, a mix of optimism and determination. When it was his turn to speak, James stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. Clad in a dark suit and tie, he adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady, yet warm. "This isn't just another conference. It's a call to action, a chance for us to come together, acknowledge our shortcomings, and commit to building a better future." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. Some nodded in agreement. Others leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "What happened to me last year opened my eyes in ways I never expected," James continued. "It reminded me that no matter how high you climb, no matter how much power or influence you have, there are systems designed to hold some people down while elevating others. These systems aren't broken. They're functioning exactly as they were intended, and if we want to create real change, we need to dismantle them brick by brick." The audience erupted in applause, but James raised a hand to quiet them. "Change isn't easy," he admitted. "It requires courage, persistence, and humility. It means admitting when we're wrong and learning from those mistakes. It means listening to voices that have been silenced for too long and amplifying their stories. Above all, it means believing that a better world is possible and working tirelessly to make it a reality." As James wrapped up his speech, he highlighted several success stories from the past year. In cities like Chicago and Atlanta, police departments had implemented comprehensive training programs focused on racial bias and cultural sensitivity. Independent review boards had successfully investigated misconduct allegations, leading to disciplinary actions against officers who violated protocols. Community policing initiatives had fostered stronger relationships between law enforcement and residents, reducing tensions and increasing trust. But perhaps the most inspiring example came from a small town in Ohio. There, a group of local activists partnered with the police department to host monthly dialogues, bringing officers and community members together to discuss issues ranging from traffic stops to use of force policies. Over time, these conversations transformed adversarial relationships into partnerships, proving that collaboration was key to lasting change. After his speech, James mingled with attendees during a networking session. Many approached him to share their thoughts or express gratitude for his leadership, One woman, a mother named Lisa, held her young son's hand as she spoke to James. "You've given us hope," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "Hope that my son won't grow up afraid of the very people who are supposed to protect him." James knelt down to meet the boy's gaze, offering him a reassuring smile. "Your mom's right," he told the child gently. "Things can get better, but it's up to all of us to make it happen." Later that evening, James returned to his hotel room, exhausted but fulfilled. As he scrolled through emails on his laptop, one caught his attention. It was from Officer Kyle, the younger cop who had stopped him over a year ago. Attached to the email was a photo of Kyle standing beside a diverse group of cadets at a police academy graduation ceremony. In the caption, Kyle wrote, "These are the future officers I'm training, officers who understand the importance of fairness, empathy, and accountability. Thank you for showing me the way." James stared at the image, feeling a surge of pride. Kyle's transformation was remarkable, proof that even those entrenched in harmful systems could evolve. But James also knew that individual growth wasn't enough. Real change required systemic overhaul, and there was still so much work to be done. The following week, James traveled to Los Angeles to participate in a roundtable discussion hosted by a prominent civil rights organization. The event brought together representatives from various sectors, law enforcement, academia, media, and advocacy groups, to brainstorm solutions for addressing racial profiling. At the table sat Dr. Evelyn Carter, who had become not only a trusted ally but also a close friend. Also present was Maya, the young organizer whose passion and dedication had inspired James countless times. During the discussion, participants debated strategies for implementing reforms nationwide. Some argued for federal mandates, ensuring uniform standards across all jurisdictions. Others advocated for localized approaches, allowing communities to tailor solutions to their unique needs. While opinions differed, everyone agreed on one thing: urgency. "We don't have the luxury of waiting," Maya declared passionately. "People are dying because of these systems. Every delay costs lives." Her words struck a chord with James, reminding him why this fight mattered so deeply. He leaned forward, addressing the group. "Reform isn't a destination, it's a journey. We won't solve everything overnight, but every step counts. Whether it's rewriting policy manuals or changing hearts and minds, we must keep moving forward. Because silence isn't neutral, it's complicity." By the end of the day, the roundtable had produced a draft framework for nationwide reforms, outlining specific steps governments, institutions, and individuals could take to combat racial profiling. James volunteered to present the proposal to senior officials at the Department of Justice, knowing it would face resistance but confident it represented a critical step toward progress. In the months that followed, James continued to advocate tirelessly for change. He testified before Congress, urging lawmakers to pass legislation holding law enforcement agencies accountable for discriminatory practices. He collaborated with tech companies to develop tools aimed at identifying and mitigating bias in policing algorithms. He even launched an initiative within the CIA to train intelligence operatives on cultural competency and ethical decision-making. Yet, amid the whirlwind of activity, James made time for reflection. Late one night, sitting alone in his study, he thought about the journey he'd undertaken. From the humiliating stop on that quiet Virginia street to becoming a symbol of resilience and reform, his life had taken unexpected turns. He realized that this fight wasn't just about fixing broken systems, it was about restoring humanity. About reminding people that behind every badge, title, or stereotype lay a human being worthy of respect and dignity. As dawn broke outside his window, casting soft golden light across the room, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with obstacles and unknowns. But he knew one truth unequivocally: change was possible. Because sometimes even the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes. 2 years had passed since the night James Caldwell was stopped by officers Kyle and Rick. But the echoes of that encounter lingered, not as a painful memory, but as a testament to resilience and transformation. What began as an act of discrimination had evolved into a nationwide movement for justice, accountability, and reform. James, once reluctant to step into the spotlight, now stood firmly at its center, using his voice and influence to push boundaries and inspire others. The journey had been long and grueling, but the progress made along the way proved that even the smallest actions could spark monumental change. By this point, James had become more than just the deputy director of the CIA. He was a symbol of hope for millions. His name appeared in headlines not because of intelligence operations or covert missions, but because of his unwavering commitment to addressing systemic racism. Communities across America rallied around him, seeing in him both a victim of injustice and a leader capable of driving meaningful reform. Yet despite the accolades and admiration, James remained grounded. He understood that true leadership wasn't about seeking recognition, it was about serving others. One sunny afternoon, James received an invitation to attend a special ceremony, honoring officers who had demonstrated exceptional dedication to equity and community engagement. The event was organized by the National Coalition for Police Reform, a group James had worked closely with over the past year. As he prepared to leave his office, he glanced at a framed photo on his desk, a picture of him standing alongside Kyle, Rick, and several other officers during a training session on implicit bias. It was a reminder of how far they'd all come. When James arrived at the venue, he was greeted by a sea of blue uniforms interspersed with civilians. Families, activists, and local leaders filled the auditorium, their faces glowing with pride and anticipation. On stage, banners proclaimed messages like "Building Trust Together" and "Justice Through Unity." The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of accomplishment and renewed purpose. As the ceremony began, a young girl walked onto the stage to deliver the opening remarks. Her name was Aliyah, and she was the daughter of a police officer who had lost his life while protecting protesters during a peaceful demonstration. Clutching the microphone tightly, Aliyah spoke with remarkable poise. "My dad taught me that being brave doesn't mean never being afraid," she said, her voice steady despite her age. "It means doing what's right even when you're scared. That's why we're here today, to honor those who choose courage over fear." The audience erupted in applause, and James felt a lump rise in his throat. Moments like these reminded him why he kept fighting. This wasn't just about policies or statistics, it was about people, about creating a world where no child had to grow up questioning whether they mattered. After Aliyah's speech, the organizers presented awards to officers who had gone above and beyond to foster trust within their communities. Among the recipients were Kyle and Rick, the same two men who had profiled James 2 years earlier. When their names were announced, the room fell silent, unsure how to react. But James stood up immediately, clapping loudly to break the tension. Slowly, others joined in, until the entire auditorium erupted in cheers. Kyle and Rick approached the stage hesitantly, their expressions a mix of gratitude and humility. As they accepted their awards, each took a moment to speak. Kyle stepped up first, his voice trembling slightly. "I used to think being a good cop meant following orders and enforcing rules," he admitted. "But I was wrong. Being a good cop means treating everyone with respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. I learned that lesson the hard way thanks to Mr. Caldwell, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to make amends." Rick followed, his tone more measured but equally sincere. "We messed up," he said bluntly. "There's no excuse for what we did that night. But instead of shutting us out, Mr. Caldwell gave us a second chance. He showed us that change is possible, if we're willing to do the work. So to anyone listening, please don't give up on us. We're trying to be better." When they finished speaking, James rose from his seat and embraced them both. The gesture sent a powerful message. Forgiveness and redemption were achievable, even in the face of profound mistakes. For many in the audience, it was a turning point, a reminder that humanity could triumph over prejudice. Later that evening, James attended a private reception hosted by the Coalition. As he mingled with guests, he found himself deep in conversation with Dr. Evelyn Carter, Maya, and other key figures in the reform movement. They discussed the challenges ahead, acknowledging that while significant strides had been made, much work remained. Racial profiling hadn't disappeared entirely, nor had mistrust between marginalized communities and law enforcement. But there was undeniable momentum and a growing understanding that collaboration was key to sustaining progress. "You've done incredible things, James," Evelyn said warmly, raising her glass in a toast. "But remember, this isn't your fight alone. It belongs to all of us," James smiled, nodding in agreement. "You're right," he replied. "This movement is bigger than any one person. It's about collective action, about ordinary people stepping up to demand extraordinary change." As the night wore on, James reflected on the countless individuals who had contributed to this journey. From grassroots organizers like Maya to policymakers drafting legislation, from officers like Kyle and Rick striving to improve their departments to families advocating for justice, every effort mattered. Each small victory added up to something greater: a shift in mindset, a dismantling of old systems, a building of new bridges. Weeks later, James returned to Langley after another whirlwind tour of speaking engagements and meetings. Sitting in his office, life had come full circle for James Caldwell. What started as a personal ordeal had transformed into a national reckoning, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths and strive for better. He knew the battle wasn't over. Racism and bias were deeply rooted issues that wouldn't vanish overnight. But he also knew that silence and complacency were no longer options. Change was happening, slowly but surely, and James intended to keep pushing forward. That evening, as he drove home through the same quiet streets where it all began, James felt a profound sense of peace. The red and blue lights flashing behind him were no longer a source of dread. They represented guardians working to protect rather than harm. Somewhere along the way, the narrative had shifted. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, James held on to one unshakable belief: sometimes even the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes.